Now, it's no accident that all the celebrations of sexual freedom that I've given you thus far have been by heterosexual men, upper-class, propertied heterosexual men. The second theme that I want to draw out to you that's really important is that the rise of sexual freedom had very different effects for men and for women, for heterosexuals, for homosexuals, for different classes and different races. Because the new permissiveness towards what was natural and the increasing stress on natural as the defining feature of what was ethically permissible also led to a sharper definition and abhorrence of supposedly unnatural behaviour. And that is most clearly visible in the increasing persecution from the 18th century onwards of same-sex behaviour. This is a sketch made by the French artist Theodore Géricault in the 1820s from life in London. And it quite possibly depicts the hanging of 3 men who've been convicted of sodomy. Before the 18th century, this would have been a rare occurrence. But throughout the 18th century, indeed up until the 1830s, men were regularly executed in England for sodomy. Between 1810 and 1835 alone, 46 men are judicially killed for this crime. Throughout the 19th century, thousands more were publicly humiliated in the pillory or sent to jail. Oscar Wilde's punishment of 2 years at hard labour in 1895 is just the best known example. And indeed, in the 20th century, there are even more prosecutions of men for same-sex behaviour. So a key effect of the first sexual revolution is to sharpen the abhorrence of homosexuality as unnatural. And yet, at the same time, the first sexual revolution also gives birth to new, modern homosexual ways of living and associating and, indeed, of arguing for sexual freedom, for gay rights as natural and private and harmless and tolerated by God in the same way as heterosexual freedom is. Let me give you a few examples of that. This is Edward Rigby, for my money, the first English icon of gay pride. He was tried and convicted of attempted sodomy in 1698. He languished in jail for several years, and one thing that's remarkable about him is simply this print. He had it commissioned and engraved just a few months after he's released from prison. It seems to show very proud and unrepentant attitude. The other thing that's remarkable about Rigby is the deposition that I found of his arguments in private to men that he was trying to convince to sleep with him. In November 1698, he picks up a young man called William Minton and takes him to a tavern, takes him into a private room, plies him with wine, sits in his lap, kisses him, puts his hand in various places, puts his tongue in his mouth, and then says, "Shall I fuck you?" And Minton says, "How can that be?" And Rigby explains that this is a perfectly normal thing, that all the great civilizations and all the great men of the past have done this. And indeed, he says, do you not read it in Scripture? Jesus and St. John the Baptist, St. John the Apostle, were lovers too. Another example, William Brown, whom I found in a different archive, a married man who went cruising in 1726 for gay sex. He found it in Moorfields in the dark. But then, suddenly, he finds himself surrounded by watchmen, shining torches into his face, arresting him, demanding what he was doing. And he was not ashamed to answer, so goes the police report. He was not ashamed to answer, "I did it because I thought I knew him, and I think there is no crime in making what use I please of my own body." That's our modern conception of sexual privacy in a nutshell. And there we find it articulated already in 1726 under great pressure by someone in defense of same-sex relations. The first public defense of homosexual relations in English was published by a young clergyman called Thomas Cannon in 1749. He called it "Ancient and Modern Pederasty Investigated and Exemplified." And there were two main lines of argument in this text. The first was that sex between men had been permitted and celebrated in many of the great civilizations of the past. Or as Cannon put it, "Every dabbler knows by his classics that boy love ever was the top refinement of most enlightened ages." His second argument was that homosexual lust was no different from any other kind. As he put it, "Unnatural desire is a contradiction in terms, downright nonsense. Desire is an amatory impulse of the inmost human parts. All of its manifestations were by definition natural." These are the same kinds of arguments that were advanced by Anne Lister, who you see here, who in her private diaries about 50 years later set down the first extended defense in English of lesbian sex. Again, there are two main strands to her reasoning. First of all, that God would understand and forgive how she felt and behaved. "Lord, have mercy on me and not justice." And the second was the great stress she laid on the naturalness of her emotions and actions. "My conduct and feelings being surely natural to me, inasmuch as they were not taught, not fictitious, but instinctive." And perhaps the most important example of all is this man, Jeremy Bentham. He's a very important example for two reasons. First of all, he's not self-interested in this topic. He's not gay. In fact, when he first starts thinking about homosexual relations, he is repelled by them. He continually talks of them as disgusting, filthy, corrupted, detestable kinds of behavior. And yet, throughout his adult life, from the 1770s to the 1820s, he feels compelled to devote huge amounts of time and energy to arguing for the rights of same-sex behavior. Hundreds of pages, and in many discussions with his followers. Bentham is the most systematic approach to this question, and he, again, has three main ways of arguing. The first is that his reading of the Bible suggests God doesn't mind at all. The Bible doesn't prohibit it. Jesus himself, says Bentham, was clearly sexually very active with women, and probably also with St. John the Baptist. Not entirely conclusive, he puts in a footnote, but probable. The second point that he articulates again and again is that sodomy is harmless. It's no more harmful than blowing your nose in public or eating oysters or smoking. All things that other people find distasteful, but that's not a reason to kill people for it. And the third argument, in his view, is that sex of all kinds was clearly the greatest source of pleasure in the world. It was the most universal, the cheapest, the most easily accessible, the most intense, the most copious source of enjoyment, the most exquisite. And he has these wonderful mathematical calculations where he tries to prove this. From a utilitarian point of view, therefore, the increase of sexual freedom would be of huge permanent benefit to humankind. As he puts it somewhere, "What calculation shall compute the aggregate mass of pleasure that may be brought into existence?"